Cyberpunk 2077 is here, and honestly, it's crazy just to think about it. Given my age, this is probably the first game that I really went through all the really long development time where I was there and aware for the whole journey. I remember this game being announced and me only being in middle school, and now I'm unemployed and a dumbass. That's 8 years, folks. Well, when you start thinking about it, that's even longer than the previous very known for being in development game. I guess that's a thing. The Last Guardian, who was about 7 years? Even if that number is a bit exaggerated, for development time at least, as realistically this game was not in full production for all that time, given we got The Witcher 3 in between this game being announced. But regardless, because of this time, a lot of people have developed some maybe not so fair expectations for this game, and that's to say the least. And not to take the centrist scapegoat here, but I'll say that I blame both parties on this one. Like I said just now, I think a lot of people have impossible projections for this game. Like it was going to be some crazy futuristic sim where you can just do anything, when CD Projekt Red never really explicitly said it would be anything like that. What CD Projekt Red did say was this was going to be an open world cyberpunk RPG, but they don't go without blame here, as they also for a big part of it catched the wave and took opportunity of the overblown reality a bit. As I review the game, it will become a lot more obvious and clear, but I'll also say that regardless of all those things, it's not gonna affect my final score, as I review the game I played and not the game promised, or more accurately hyped. But a few things need to be addressed before we start though. No matter what I say about this game, it does not really apply to the base PS4 or Xbox One users. If your primary way of playing games is in one of those consoles, then your game doesn't run at what I would call a playable frame rate. And I cannot, regardless of the quality of the game itself, ever recommend those versions in their current state. Speaking of current state, this game is also at the moment Bethesda levels of broken, or maybe even worse, which I think goes more on a personal basis, because I personally had a couple of game breaking bugs or glitches. For example, I had a line of dialogue just stuck on the screen one time and it wouldn't let me analyze anything until that line was over, so I couldn't progress. Another time I had a character I had to talk to sitting on the couch, but as I approached this character, she would sink into the couch and onto another dimension, making it impossible to talk to her. But I still wasn't too annoyed, and this is partly because it was nothing a reload of the game or going to an early save wouldn't fix. And saving in this game is much like in Bethesda games. You have an ability to quick save, and it's even why in those Bethesda games I tend to not mind the bugs and glitches so much. Of course, a game that's not so buggy would be much better, and your mileage may vary. Some people have way worse experience with this game than I did, and some people will probably have better experiences. It can be very random, but this game is definitely broken on a lot of levels. And if you're playing on consoles where quote-unquote quick saving takes longer, it can be even more frustrating. So just be aware during my review that I didn't really get super annoyed by bugs, is what I'm trying to say. Moving on to the actual game, story-wise, Cyberpunk is oddly short for a Projekt Red game. The main story of the game will run you for 20 hours and 60 hours for 100% completion, which I did for this game, which is not short at all, but it definitely fits itself more closely to other games of its genre, like modern Deus Ex games, than previous Project Red games like The Witcher 3, which is more around the 50-hour mark just for the main story. But regardless of the actual time to beat of this game, the main story of this game feels short in its premise, and it's a far cry from the long political drama of The Witcher 3, here being a much more personal journey. If I explain to you the story premise as it exists after the prologue, then you pretty much know how the story is gonna go, being it's rather simple. After an admittedly fantastically engaging prologue full of spectacle, which is extra effective when the game is new to you, and it's also very graphically impressive. But after that, the story is revealed to be, well, you have Johnny Silverhand, played by Keanu Reeves, stuck in your head, and if you don't get it out, you're going to die. And without giving away too many details, that's pretty much it for the premise of the main story. And there's not a lot of twists to it. The game never gets more crazy and bombastic than it does in the prologue for the most part. You're playing as a dying man, while V definitely feels a lot more like a real character than most of these build-a-character RPGs. It's still just kinda okay. He's no Geralt. You can choose between 3 life passes as well, that not so much affect the actual story, but more your past and the things you know, and how people will perceive you, which I'll be honest, given there's already a dialogue system that works without this, it can feel like it's just there for the sake of being there. Regardless, the story works not so much on the beeline to the credits, but in everything around it, as there is a lot of side content and side characters you can involve into your story, and they may even play into the end of the game for some of these more important characters. This being helped by the character being a lot more of a character, like I said before, and these side characters are just as well written as the main ones. They feel like real people living in a dystopian future. Much like The Witcher 3, this goes great lengths to make the world more believable and lived in. And it's also through these side characters you get a lot more of the cyberpunk themes and stories you expect out of this world, with the critiques of capitalism and class disparity, and more personal themes like identity and control. For example, in one of the more odd side quests of this game, we find out this soon-to-be mayor is being mind-controlled or manipulated by someone in a very subtle and creepy way, leaving you wonder if this person has any agency or control over their current life. Overall, I was very engaged, not so much by the story, but the stories of this world and the people in it, which I think is a great thing, making this world feel real. There are also multiple endings I must address, but for the most part, there's only 2 endings, with a few but significant variations within them. Even the secret ending falls into one of these, and it's alright. Like I said before, this story is more interesting for the world around it than it is for the story itself. Also, before we move away, I draw your attention to a movie called Johnny Mnemonic, a cyberpunk movie from 1995 starring a man named Johnny, played by Keanu Reeves. Now, I haven't watched this movie, and well, it doesn't particularly have good reviews, but from reading the synopsis for it, it actually shares a lot of common things with the story and the world of this game. Keanu playing a character named Johnny being the biggest one, I guess. And even with its bad reviews, I'll be checking it out purely out of curiosity for the possible connection to this game. Regardless of that aside though, moving on to the gameplay, and earlier I said that this was like a Deus Ex game, and it is and it isn't. It's somewhere in between that and a game like Fallout and Skyrim. There is that very immersive sim-like gameplay where you can approach each scenario in various different ways, usually very dictated by your character build, but you can even get creative and have the game respond to that, which is really cool. It legitimately feels like a Bethesda game like Fallout and Skyrim, with its big RPG elements and equipment, but also its quest layout mixed in with modern Deus Ex games, more stealth-oriented gameplay, with also dialogue options that you can use to avoid conflict or incite it. Which on a personal note is great, because I'll be honest, after the commercial disaster that was Mankind Divided, I don't think we're going to be getting a real Deus Ex game for a while. Regardless, some of these dialogue options are based on your character's stats. Like for example, if you invested your character points into his physical strength, it also means your character is more physically intimidating, opening options to scare certain characters, avoiding actual confrontation. Speaking of character stats, being that this game is an RPG, you'll be able to level up your character and shape him to your preferred playstyle. For example, stealth starts out very simple with very simple hacks. You can use your advantage like distracting enemies, but as you invest in that skill and subsequently its skill tree, you'll gain more options, making it more complex and varied, allowing you to pull strategies that would be impossible in the beginning, and also making the more simple missions incredibly easy. You'll have a big focus on a couple of styles, as the level cap is 50 and each skill has a level cap of 20. And in this type of game, it is usually better to be a master of something than a jack of all trades. I find that in this type of games, you usually push to go for something more on the stealth side, as usually the brute force approach just isn't all that fun, or the game just isn't built for direct combat. But Cyberpunk actually does well in this regard. It's surprisingly satisfying, with some alright AI, assuming you're within level, but to be fair, the stealth option is also made a lot harder with overleveled enemies, even if I think it's still a lot easier to get away with than the combat approach like in those other games. Something that also affects your character build and playstyle is the modifications. You can do it on a body level, being this is a cyberpunk game, body modifications are the norm, and you can change your character a lot, and a lot of it will be mostly stats wise, which is fine, but it's also a bit disappointing, given the changes that are actually visually represented in the game are really cool. For example, you can modify your legs to literally have double jump, or your arms to have rocket launchers, or a blade, or gorilla arms. That they don't look like gorilla arms, just putting it out there. Just punch really hard, but it's still cool. Overall, the gameplay is really good. It's not particularly very innovative, but it does what it does really well. If you're dying to play some Deus Ex or Dishonored, or even some Fallout, this might be something you really enjoy. Because arguably, gameplay wise, it does what all of those games do, but in this new setting, and in some cases, arguably does them better. Now, moving on to the open world and its mission structures. Because of the gameplay and how it works, most missions will revolve around infiltrating somewhere and retrieving something or someone. And because of the very open level design, if you can talk your way into somewhere, then you can probably enter through the back door. And if that doesn't work, then maybe a window or even the ceiling. It is very much going for that immersive theme approach with its missions, and because of it, it can feel very satisfying to find your own way to complete a mission. The only problem I have with it is the lack of variety. Outside of that, most missions will follow this structure, and it can get very repetitive. After the prologue, there just isn't as much set pieces. Probably they didn't want to take away control from the player, but I honestly wouldn't mind a little bit more scripted events to cut in a bit of variety into the core gameplay. Thankfully, that does happen in the side missions, funny enough, which I have divided into primarily 3 types. We have first the police jobs. These are the most simple ones, just dealing with groups of enemies or recovering something from a group of enemies. And these are very simple. They're pretty much the type of side missions you get in Ubisoft open world games. These don't even get their unique buildings, mostly taking place in just open places. And they feel like filler. By the end of it, I was completing these missions in less than a minute each. I would just run to the objective, get it and run away, and it would still work. The only real reason to do this is, well, leveling up, making money, or eddies as they call them here, haha, and the possibility of rare items like weapons and armors to equip yourself with. Even these other small items like chips that you can equip into weapons or armors to change their properties, like being immune to poison or making your weapons non-lethal. Which, by the way, non-lethal, much like in Deus Ex, is an option here. But I think it's a lot harder here, because not only are you in an open world where it's just very easy to accidentally run over someone, but also it can be somewhat hard sometimes to tell if you just incapacitated someone or actually killed them in the heat of combat, especially with the visual clutter on screen and, well, the bugs. But regardless, other missions also give you these rewards as well. Then we have the jobs that fixers will give you, fixers being like a middleman between clients and V who is doing these jobs. These are similar to the main missions but a lot more simplified and shorter, also mostly revolving around infiltrating areas and retrieving something, which you might have heard me say that earlier in the review. There's a bit more variation to this, with some more action focused missions where stealth isn't really an option, like boxing matching or dealing with psycho killers. They're definitely a lot better than the police jobs and actually feel like thought was put into them. Some of them actually having a little bit of story built into them to give you more motivation and making it more interesting to complete. And it works out alright. It still has some repetition problems, much like the main game, which is a bit sad, but whatever. And then we have what I call the character side missions. These missions usually do not have fixers involved, making them more personal as you interact with the clients directly. These are the most varied set of missions in the whole game. Some will have a focus on driving, while others might have a focus on talking, and anything in between. These are a lot more engaging to play out, and these characters having their own arcs, with some of the stories spanning multiple missions, and some you'll be able to romance, giving you fit into their sexual preferences. These missions are, in my opinion, the strongest part of the game. They're the most engaging and also the most varied, even more varied than the main missions. And if you're playing through the game, I recommend doing them. Not only does it make the game longer, it also makes it better. Now we have to talk about the actual open world, and it's big and dense in detail. It's seriously amazing to look at in this year 2020, and against all odds it ran great on my machine. I have a 5700 XT and I got a locked 60 FPS. To be fair, only a couple days after I started playing, and with some help from the internet, especially Digital Foundry, which had me running the game for the most part with the highest settings. But I can understand, especially if you don't quite understand those PC settings, I can understand why your game might not be running very well. If you don't quite understand those PC settings, I'm not an expert either, and they can be very confusing even if you know things. Like I said, it can be easy to see why there's so many videos of people running this game at low frame rates, even in powerful machines. But regardless, the world is gorgeous, but there's not much to do in it after you have finished the side missions. To the point where, when I finished everything, I had not reached the level cap, and to be fair, I put almost 60 hours into this game. I got my money's worth, but I wish there was more to do in this world outside of missions, kinda like in Yakuza games. It would have really helped making this world feel even more alive. and I wish it had more of a reason to have me come back even after the story is over. The reason I forgive this, or at least I don't count it as a really big setback, is, well, one, the time of course, but also because the story condemns this city and its activities so much, and then having you indulge in them for hours might be a bit hypocrite. But I don't believe that's probably the reason they didn't put activities in the game or more things to do. I think it was more of a time thing. But just a bit disappointing, but not something that particularly makes the game worse. Now, something a bit more nitpicky, but the minimap is also odd. In terms of, it just feels too zoomed in, making the GPS annoying to follow, as most of the times I can see the corner in the game itself before it's in the minimap, meaning a lot of the times, and I mean a lot, while driving any car that's even slightly fast, you will not have enough time to brake once you see the supposed turn at any given corner. Also, moving on to another critique of this game, the one thing that I thought is really weird and pretty much nonsensical is customization of the character. And the character's face wise, it's whatever. The customization is not too deep, but it doesn't matter because you will almost never see the character's face, given that this is a first person game. The thing that feels nonsensical is the genitals. Yeah, the thing everyone is joking about, and honestly for good reason. Now, I'm no prude, I don't really mind nudity in my games, but it seems very weird to be given the option to personalize your genitals when you literally never see them in actual gameplay, not even in sex scenes. In fact, without playing cheeky with the camera mode, the only other time you see fully exposed genitals in the whole game that I can recall is during a flashback, and they're not even yours. So realistically, you only have it so you can look at it when you take off your pants in the inventory menu. Because even when you get your character pantless, he will still be using boxers in the actual gameplay. It doesn't even work in that more comedical way like the Saints Row series does, if you have played those games. My guess is they had much bigger plans for this game that just never came to fruition, and this just happened to be a leftover of it. That, or they wanted to make this a much more mature game, but were afraid of reaching the infamous adult rating, which I guess would explain the overabundance of dildos in the game. It is a very sexualized world, a very exaggerated version of ours, and it goes with the cyberpunk aesthetic, but it can feel underdeveloped in that sense, as they don't actually do much with it. Now, to finish up, I want to talk about the voice acting and the music. Voice acting is really good, and the elephant in the room, Keanu Reeves, and his performance is about as good as his acting. That's all I'm gonna say. No, but for real, he's okay, and definitely miles better than the 4 minutes of voice acting Sutherland. Yep, I'm still mad about that one. Soundtrack wise, it was fitting. It has its moments, but it felt repetitious. Moving around the world, there's only a handful of radio stations, and I found myself hearing the same songs a lot. I know they went with some big names to make some real songs for this game, against the more conventional way of just licensing music, which makes sense here because of the setting, but it's probably also very expensive, and why there isn't more of it. And finally, I'm going to be scoring this game, but with an asterisk, because it's very hard not only to score, but also recommend a game this highly when it's this buggy, and also this unplayable in certain machines. So I'm giving this an 8 out of 10. It is a great game that doesn't really push the medium forwards. It may not even be better than The Witcher 3, and it's no Deus Ex killer story-wise, but does a lot of what we have seen before really well in the gameplay. And again, do I recommend it despite all of its problems? And my answer is, if you can tolerate some bugs, and if you have a machine that can run it well, and then yes, you should. But those are big ifs. And if you don't fit within those, then I would wait until this game gets fixed. If history is to repeat itself, then this is bound to be a much more polished game in the future, as The Witcher 3 also had quite a rocky start with a similar bad console performance, but also I don't think it was ever on the same level as this. Also, if you go into this game expecting a GTA 6 with insane set pieces, then you'll probably not like this game. But if you go expecting either an open world, Deus Ex, or a Bethesda game, then you might actually be quite happy with it. And if you're expecting a Bethesda game on launch, then you're probably already used to the bugs anyways. Regardless, it's your choice to make, and hopefully this video helped you make that choice, regardless of your decision. And that has been it. This is probably, well, not probably, surely my longest review yet. To be fair, it's also the first game I purposefully went for the 100% before I made the review. Not the first time it happened though, there was bug snacks. Regardless, I hope you have a good day, and may you consider subscribing and leaving a like, and even commenting. This is a big game and there's a lot of to talk about it. Even if you have something to say, you can say it in the questions, the comments. That's a thing. Regardless, I took a fucking week off to play this game. I actually didn't because I'm jobless. I said that at the beginning. But I took a week off doing videos for YouTube to be able to review this game. Thankfully, I already had some videos back up, so I could do it and not feel bad about it. Because I still had videos uploading. Yeah. Anyways, bye.